A long-running Leandro school funding lawsuit returns soon to the North Carolina Supreme Court. And joining us with some expert analysis of this case is Dr. Terry Stoops. He is the director of the Center for Effective Education at the John Locke Foundation. And first of all, Terry, give us a little bit of a thumbnail. What's this Leandro case all about?
Well, to really understand Leandro, you have to go back to the origin of school funding cases like Leandro. In 1970, there was a lawsuit in California called Serrano versus Priest that sought to increase education funding through the courts. And through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, progressive activists and legal scholars have been filing lawsuits in order to do just that. Make sure that the courts compel legislatures to increase education funding. That came to North Carolina in 1994 with the Leandro case, which was decided by the North Carolina Supreme Court in 1997. And that's where we get the origin of this phrase, an opportunity for a sound basic education. Now, the case was remanded to the trial court, and we're actually on our third judge at this point that's overseeing the implementation of the case. It took a additional stop at the North Carolina Supreme Court in 2004, and of course, as you said, is going to be back at the Supreme Court here in 2022. The case, just like all of the cases in other states and that we've seen here across the nation, is really centered on education funding and whether the courts have the authority to bypass a legislature or compel a legislature to increase education funding using a constitutional provision that is somewhat vague but is open to interpretation by the courts.
You mentioned this case started in 1994. Much has changed in the last 28 years, especially since Republicans took control of the General Assembly after the 2010 election. So over the past decade, lots of Republican policies. How have things changed during that last decade or so that people should know about?
Well, because this is so much about education funding, you look to see what the Republicans have done since 2011 to address education funding issues. And you find that there have been substantial increases in education funding. Here are just a few of the highlights. First, the percentage of the North Carolina General Fund dedicated to K-12 education has increased almost every year. Teacher salaries, the average teacher salaries in North Carolina have increased by 20% over that period. North Carolina's average teacher pay used to be 7th in the Southeast in 2011, is now 3rd in the Southeast. The percentage of state-funded employees and teachers has far outpaced enrollment growth. And finally, if you adjust the state per pupil expenditure for inflation, you find that we've increased that by $1,000. So you can see that a $1,000 increase per student adjusted for inflation, along with increases in personnel and increases in general fund appropriations, means that the Republicans have been extraordinarily attentive to increasing education funding for our public school students in North Carolina.
You mentioned early on that this is a case about education funding, and the plaintiffs continue to ask for more education funding. So far, during the first couple of stops at the state Supreme Court, that court has not decided to say the state has to spend more money.
Well, Judge Howard Manning was very clear that this case was supposed to be about how the state spends money and not how much they spent. And so one thing that Judge Manning did was to focus on the expenditures that were being made and asking if North Carolina public schools were maximizing the amount of funding that they were receiving from the state. He found that they were not. But there was a shift in that focus when Judge David Lee took over the case on its remand, and he shifted the focus to focus more on how much is being spent. And then the introduction of the Wested report and the collusive agreement between the plaintiffs and the defendants meant that the entire conversation about Leandro soon became about the level of funding, and focus on how that money is being spent was completely abandoned.
Well, the case goes back, as we said, to the North Carolina Supreme Court, and we know that one person who's going to be watching very closely is Dr. Terry Stoops. He is the director of the Center for Effective Education at the John Locke Foundation. Please look at johnlocke.org and carolinajournal.com for updates on this developing story.